आपका अपना चैनल इंडिया A1 न्यूज, जो रखे आपको A1।
Circumstances in which they are faced, but the enemy is ruthless and desperate, and he is armed to the teeth. Against such a brutal foe, no amount of civil disobedience or of sabotage or of revolutionary terrorism can be of any avail. If therefore we want to expel British power from India, we have to fight the enemy.
जिंदगी है कौम की तो कौम पे लुटाए जा।
दिल्ली के इंडियन इंटरनेशनल सेंटर में ओरिएंट ब्लैक स्वान और नेताजी रिसर्च ब्यूरो कोलकाता द्वारा नेताजी सुभाष चंद्र बोस के जीवन और विरासत पर एक चर्चा का आयोजन किया गया। जिस समय भारत अपनी आज़ादी की 75वीं वर्षगांठ मना रहा है, भारत के प्रमुख प्रकाशन गृहों में से एक ओरिएंट ब्लैक स्वान और नेताजी रिसर्च ब्यूरो कोलकाता ने नेताजी सुभाष चंद्र बोस के जीवन और विरासत पर एक चर्चा का आयोजन किया। चर्चा उन 3 पुस्तकों पर केंद्रित थी जिन्हें दिवंगत शिशिर के बोस और प्रोफेसर सुगाता बोस ने संपादित किया है। कार्यक्रम का आरंभ प्रोफेसर सुगाता बोस द्वारा 3 पुस्तकों द इंडियन स्ट्रगल 1920 to 1942, एन इंडियन पिलग्रिम, एन अनफिनिश्ड ऑटोबायोग्राफी और द एसेंशियल राइटिंग ऑफ नेताजी सुभाष चंद्र बोस पर एक प्रेजेंटेशन के साथ हुआ। इस कार्यक्रम में फिल्म फुटेज और ऐतिहासिक तस्वीरों की विशेष स्क्रीनिंग और नेताजी द्वारा लिखित मूल पांडुलिपियों का प्रदर्शन भी किया गया।
who are going to participate in the coming battles will survive to see India free. But whether we survive or not, whether we individually live to see India free or not, we are confident that India shall be free.
हम अपनी हिंद बनाएंगे, हम दिल्ली दिल्ली जाएंगे, हम अपनी हिंद बनाएंगे। अब फौज बन के रहना है, दुख दर्द मुसीबत सहना है। अब फौज बन के रहना है, दुख दर्द मुसीबत सहना है। सुभाष का कहना कहना है, चलो दिल्ली चल के रहना है। सुभाष का कहना कहना है, चलो दिल्ली चल के रहना है। अपनी हिंद बनाएंगे, हम दिल्ली दिल्ली जाएंगे, हम अपनी हिंद बनाएंगे। हम गोली खा के झूमेंगे, हम मौत को बढ़कर चूमेंगे। हम गोली खा के झूमेंगे, हम मौत को बढ़कर चूमेंगे। मतवाले बन आजादी के, हम दरिया जंगल घूमेंगे। मतवाले बन।
And he is armed to the teeth. Against such a brutal foe, no amount of civil disobedience or of sabotage or of revolutionary terrorism can be of any avail. If therefore we want to expel British power from India, we have to fight the enemy with his own weapons. The enemy has already drawn the sword. He must therefore be fought with the sword. But it is not possible for our countrymen at home to organize an armed revolution and to fight the British army of occupation with modern arms. This is a task which must therefore devolve on Indians living abroad and particularly on Indians living in East Asia. Friends, if you compare the history of our national struggle with histories of similar struggles in other parts of the world, you will realize that we in India have lacked one thing and one thing alone. We lack the strength an organization whereby we can meet force with force. I am confident that with the help of my countrymen in East Asia, I shall be able to organize such a gigantic force as will be able to sweep away the British power from India in conjunction with those who have already been fighting at home. The hour has struck, and every patriotic Indian must advance towards the field of battle. Only when the blood of freedom-loving Indians begins to flow will India attain her freedom. Inqilab Zindabad. Azad Hind Zindabad.
In another revolutionary move, Netaji formed a women's regiment of the Indian National Army named after the legendary heroine of the 1857 revolt, the Rani of Jhansi. This regiment, commanded by Lakshmi Swaminathan, was designed to contribute not only to national liberation, but more importantly, to the social emancipation of Indian women.
Women also have to fight for their freedom, and in the case of women, they will be fighting for two things. One, the independence of their country, and the second thing is their own independence and emancipation. Because he said, I have always felt very strongly that our Indian women who are capable of reaching tremendous heights, they are so completely neglected. Not only neglected, they are suppressed by our archaic social laws. So unless they fight for their own emancipation along with the freedom of the country, our country also won't progress in the right direction, and this is a very necessary thing.
In the first week of December, Netaji was suddenly released from prison after a spell of hunger strike. He came home, and soon thereafter he called me, and we met in this room. And he asked me in Bengali, "Amar ekta kaj korte parbe?" And that started a long session of confabulations and discussions lasting for a month and a half, day after day, night after night, in order to work out what Netaji called a foolproof escape plan from this house. In the course of these discussions on the plan, Netaji introduced me to Mia Akbar Shah of Peshawar, who actually visited Calcutta on a pretext. And with Mia Akbar Shah, I actually made certain purchases for Netaji's disguise as a Muslim upcountry gentleman, an insurance agent who was traveling around the country. Finally, on the night of the 16th, 17th January 1941, Netaji and we tiptoed out of that room, walked down the entire length of the house, down that corridor, down the passage in the annexe of the house, down the rear staircase. Then drove out this driveway out of the building around 1:35 a.m. Took a turn to the right and to the south to mislead any possible watchers, but eventually took the Grand Trunk Road and drove the whole night to reach Dhanbad early in the morning. We kept Netaji hidden in my brother's house at a place called Barari near Dhanbad, and the next evening we bade him goodbye as if he was a stranger, then picked him up again in my car from the road and drove him up to Gomo station and reached him there to catch the Delhi Kalka mail on his way to Peshawar.
प्रोफेसर सुगाता बोस और पूर्व संसद सदस्य सुश्री सुभाषिनी अली ने नेताजी के आजादी के संघर्ष के बारे में बताया।
Felt that Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose was such a great person that he did not need to be protected from criticism, and so we've always had lively sort of debates there. And I'm glad that you've said that you emerged from a political movement which initially had been quite critical of Netaji. And I still remember it was for the first time in January 1977 that Jyoti Basu came to Netaji Bhavan,
Yes.
And made a historic speech in which he said that that they had made a mistake in their assessment of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. And the one point, I agree with most of what you've said, but there is one point on which I have a slight disagreement, and which is that, you know, of your two parents, in some ways your mother, possibly even influenced by you, also moved towards the communist movement in the post-independence
Not
period.
influenced by me, but anyway.
But your father did not.
Yes.
Prem Kumar Saigal was very different in terms of his political views. But one thing that I've always constantly heard Auntie Lakshmi say, that whatever might be the general assessment of Japan at that time, she would always, in her speeches at Netaji Bhavan, express her gratitude to the Japanese people. And this despite having become a communist. And that was because she knew that there were Japanese officers like General Fujiwara Hieichi, who played such a big role in the formation of the Indian National Army, and that ultimately the Japanese soldiers, the ordinary soldiers, and the INA soldiers fought side by side and shed their blood together in the battlefields of Imphal and Kohima. And that sort of joint sacrifice is something that needed to be honored and respected.
Yes.
But of all the other points that you've made, I entirely agree. Generally, you know, Netaji was talking about women's rights again from the 1920s. He was saying in his major speeches, which we have included in the essential writings, that there were three large communities that were oppressed in India. And he said these were the laboring masses, and he included both workers and peasants. The second, depressed classes, by which he meant the subordinated castes. And third, the women of India. So he was actually talking about class, caste, and gender-based exploitation and the need to fight against these inequities from the very beginning. And of course, ultimately, he showed what women could do in our fight for freedom by forming the Rani of Jhansi regiment. And you're absolutely right. I mean, even in your, he just shattered the martial races myth. Because, of course, there were Punjabis and Pathans in the Azad Hind Fauj, but there were Tamils and Telugu speakers and Malayali speakers, and most of the ordinary recruits in the Rani of Jhansi regiment were rubber plantation workers in Malaya. And so they, for the first time, got some dignity as citizens of the Azad Hind government that had been proclaimed on the 21st of October of 1943. And I entirely agree with you about what you've said about attempts at appropriation, but in my new introduction to the 10th anniversary edition of my book, His Majesty's Opponent, I have said that it is not as easy to appropriate Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose as it is to appropriate Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, because his life is so crystal clear what he stood for. And as I say, Netaji's military heroism is hollow if divorced from his unequivocal commitment to religious harmony. And that's something that we must remember today. And he was not just a warrior hero. Why are we bringing out these volumes of his works? That's because this was a warrior who paused between battles and thought about, how would India be rebuilt? What would the social and economic reconstruction of India look like once India was free? Because he was one leader of the independence movement who actually believed that India will be free, and we have to be prepared for a massive social and economic transformation. And the other aspect, which I think is extremely important, which we have highlighted in particularly the selection in the essential writings, is that he, along with Nehru, were interested in international affairs. And he was constantly thinking in terms of how could one build international support for the cause of India's freedom. And he sometimes, changed his mind. For example, if you look at his 1937 writings, he has two long essays, one called Europe Today and Tomorrow. He's, of course, very critical of Germany after spending 3 years in Europe and having visited all of the European countries. He even wrote an essay called Japan's Role in the Far East, where he's very critical of Japan's invasion of China. But then he decided that, it wasn't a war just between the Axis powers and the Allied powers. There was a third side. These were the colonized peoples of Asia and Africa. And therefore he felt that he needed to take advantage of the international war crisis in order to strike for India's freedom. And we have to accept that it wasn't a simple choice of enemies, my friend. He had been in the independence movement for 20 years, from 1921 onwards up to 1941. And he had seen how the civilian masses in India had rallied to the non-cooperation and civil disobedience movements led by Mahatma Gandhi. But the Indian soldiers had remained insulated from the swirling currents of civilian discontent in India. And where and how could he approach these Indian soldiers? The only way he could do it was to go to the places where the soldiers who had fought for the British King Emperor were being held as prisoners by the enemies of Britain. And so one has to understand his reasoning, and he ultimately succeeded. He just destroyed the ultimate instrument of imperial control, because the British could no longer rely on the Indian soldiers to hold Indians in subjection. And that became crystal clear, after the Red Fort trials of Saigal Dhilan and Shah Nawaz.
कार्यक्रम के अंत में दर्शकों के साथ संवाद हुआ। दर्शकों में जीवन के सभी क्षेत्रों के लोग शामिल हुए, जिसमें शिक्षाविद, छात्र और मीडिया के लोग मौजूद रहे। शिशिर कुमार बोस ने 1957 में नेताजी रिसर्च ब्यूरो की स्थापना की और साल 2000 में उनकी मृत्यु तक उनके मार्गदर्शक रहे। वे भारतीय स्वतंत्रता संग्राम में एक भागीदार थी। उन्हें अंग्रेजों ने लाहौर किले, लाल किले और लयालपुर जेल में कैद करके रखा था। स्वतंत्रता के बाद की अवधि में एक प्रसिद्ध बाल रोग विशेषज्ञ रहे। उन्होंने उपनिवेश विरोधी आंदोलन की सर्वोत्तम परंपराओं को संरक्षित करने और इसके इतिहास के लेखन को संभव बनाने में महत्वपूर्ण भूमिका निभाई। सुगाता बोस नेताजी सुभाष चंद्र बोस के परपोते हैं और हार्वर्ड विश्वविद्यालय में इतिहास के गार्डिनर प्रोफेसर हैं। इस मौके पर प्रोफेसर सुगाता बोस ने उपस्थित दर्शकों को नेताजी और इन किताबों के बारे में बताते हुए कहा। प्रोफेसर सुगाता बोस ने नेताजी और इन किताबों के बारे में बताते हुए इंडिया एवन न्यूज से खास बातचीत की।
सुगाता बोस, मैं हार्वर्ड यूनिवर्सिटी में प्रोफेसर हूँ और नेताजी रिसर्च ब्यूरो के चेयरपर्सन।
आज के कार्यक्रम के बारे में सर बताएं।
आज हम लोग नेताजी के तीन किताब को नया एडिशन रिलीज़ किया। एक है एन इंडियन पिलग्रिम, जो नेताजी का ऑटोबायोग्राफी है, अनफिनिश्ड ऑटोबायोग्राफी, 1921 तक उनका जीवन पर उन्होंने लिखा था। और एक किताब है द इंडियन स्ट्रगल, वो है उनका इतिहास 1920 से 1942 तक, जो हम लोग का स्वाधीनता संग्राम हुआ उसका इतिहास। और हम लोग एक किताब बनाया, वो द एसेंशियल राइटिंग्स ऑफ नेताजी सुभाष चंद्र बोस। उनका सब राइटिंग स्पीचेस हम लोग 12 वॉल्यूम में प्रकाश किया, लेकिन सब लोग तो 12 वॉल्यूम पढ़ नहीं सकता, इसीलिए एक वॉल्यूम में सबसे जो गुरुत्वपूर्ण जो सब है वो एसेंशियल राइटिंग्स में हम लोग डाला।
देश को आज़ाद कराने में नेताजी का बहुत ही अहम रोल है, तो इस किताब के माध्यम से लोगों को क्या कहने की कोशिश की जा रही है?
नेताजी ने कहा था, आप तो देखा अभी कि हम जिंदा रहे या मरे वो कोई बात नहीं है, सही बात ये है, अहम बात ये है, हिंदुस्तान आज़ाद होगा। वही उनका बात ही आज।
देश को आज़ाद कराने में अहम भूमिका निभाने वाले नेताजी सुभाष चंद्र बोस के बारे में और उनके जीवन पर आधारित किताबों के बारे में जानकर आपको कैसा लगा, कमेंट बॉक्स में जरूर लिखें। देश विदेश और फिल्मी दुनिया की ताज़ा तरीन खबरों के लिए देखते रहिए इंडिया एवन न्यूज, जो रखी आपको एवन।